But we have to start with the latest on China-U.S. trade because the U.S. is temporarily easing its restrictions against Huawei. That's just one day after Google said it would suspend Huawei's license to use Google's proprietary Android software. Now, Google has confirmed that this move by the U.S. allows Google to keep providing Android software updates for existing Huawei phones for the next 90 days. We had explained right here on the show yesterday how Google's action against Huawei was a response to President Trump's executive order from last week, but now it looks like the Trump administration is seeking to alleviate the burden of its actions for American companies like Google. Rick Newman is joining us to help explain further. So many twists and turns to this story. Goodness gracious.
I'm not sure I can, but well, let's try. I mean, so the bigger picture here is last week, you're right, President Trump did basically put a ban on U.S. companies doing business with China. This is different, but related to the tariffs on Chinese imports that he has raised and others that he's threatened to raise higher. But this apparently is meant to pressure China even more than the tariffs are supposed to make some kind of deal. So what the Trump administration has now done is said, this ban on doing business with Huawei remains in place. However, we're going to establish a 90-day, essentially a grace period, so that I think two things. U.S. companies can kind of wind down their business dealings with Huawei in an orderly way if the ban actually stays in place, or this is essentially part of the negotiating window with China on the broader issue of the trade deal.
Well, and as a result, it does lend credence to the idea we were discussing yesterday that this isn't two separate stories. Right. You know, the action against Huawei, people say, well, this is separate from the ongoing trade discussions and the tariffs. Well, it isn't really fully
I would say it's like 1.5 separate stories. So the concerns about Huawei possibly being an arm or an appendage of the Chinese government when the Chinese government should want to use it. I mean, this is a real concern that national security experts have had for a long time. This is not new. And given what we know about Chinese espionage and especially corporate espionage, stealing trade secrets and stuff like this, I mean, this actually is probably a real concern. The second issue, of course, is the trade dispute with China, where President Trump wants China to buy more stuff from the United States and for the trade deficit to go down. That is a different matter altogether. So he's using the national security concerns relating to Huawei to get some leverage in his trade negotiations.
I guess we should clarify, because it's so muddled, right? That this is actually not the result of the executive order, but it's the Department of Commerce adding Huawei.
Well, this isn't right, but what Google did yesterday.
But Google's is in relation to what the Department of Commerce did to add Huawei onto the entity list. And there's no question, like Rick pointed out, it's tied to the China negotiations, but officially, at least, it is about Huawei violating the Iran sanctions. And so it feels like everything is just being thrown into one big discussion.
Well, you're right, and I think it's clear what the Trump administration is trying to do is saying, what tools do we have at our disposal to increase our leverage over China? And the reality is they do have these tools. I mean, this is complicated because when the U.S. puts sanctions on a company as big as Huawei, one of the things we're seeing is a split between the United States and our allies or our former allies, such as the European nations and others, where we're saying we're not going to do any business at all with Huawei, trying to persuade other countries to do the same. And they're saying, we're not going along with you on this. They sell all this communications gear, which is already in our communications network. We're fine with them as a vendor. They sell good stuff. We're happy with the quality and the price and stuff like that. So there's a split between the U.S. And most foreign nations on this. That's part of the problem. But I mean, Trump is really winding up everything he can think to throw at the Chinese, and I think this is part of that.
Well, and allowing companies more time to wind down those relations with Huawei is really necessary because not just Google, but other companies have come out and said, if you want us to switch suppliers, then that's going to take some time.
And if you want to take the Chinese side, it gives them more time to build out their chips, right? Stockpile some things that they have been for the last year and
that's a possible
build out the operating system.
So you're right. I think part of this is go a little easier on the American companies than you thought, because some of them are going to endure some losses. Are going to have to. I mean, there's a transition cost here. We've seen a couple of smaller suppliers. Their stock's been hurt because Huawei is a significant source of revenue. So he's trying to give a little bit of a lifeline to those firms, but it's really about getting leverage with China. And with Trump, he keeps having to make this case that we have to endure some pain now for bigger gains later.
All right, we'll see.
Whether you buy that or not is another question.
Right, exactly. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks.